Ethan didn't talk much about his time in Afghanistan. Like most soldiers, he preferred to let the past stay where it belonged. His tours were rough, but he'd made it home in one piece, and that was more than some of his buddies could say. He'd settled into civilian life quietly, moving to a small house in the foothills of the West Virginia mountains. The isolation suited him. Out there, the air was clean, the nights were quiet, and he could keep his thoughts in check. He'd taken to hiking the nearby trails to keep his mind busy. It reminded him of the long patrols he used to do, minus the weight of a pack or the ever-present threat of danger. But there was one trail he avoided. Locals called it the Old Logging Road, though it hadn't been used for logging in decades. It cut deep into the forest, winding past an abandoned mill and a scattering of forgotten cabins. People said the area was cursed, though no one could agree why. Ethan wasn't superstitious, but he'd heard enough strange stories to know when to keep his distance. That changed one evening when his dog, Scout, bolted into the woods after a rabbit. Ethan called after him, but the dog didn't come back. He could hear Scout barking deeper and deeper into the trees, and before he knew it, he was standing at the mouth of the old logging road. "Damn it, Scout," he muttered, adjusting the hunting knife strapped to his belt. He didn't like the idea of going in there, but he wasn't about to leave his dog behind. The sun was setting as Ethan followed the trail, the orange light filtering through the trees. Scout's barking echoed faintly ahead, and he quickened his pace, his instincts kicking in. The air felt colder the further he went, and the usual forest sounds had faded into an unsettling silence. After about 20 minutes, he reached the clearing by the old mill. The building was a sagging, weathered skeleton, its windows broken and its roof caved in. Scout's barking had stopped, replaced by an eerie stillness. Ethan's hand went to his knife, his senses sharpening. He scanned the area, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. Then he saw it. At first, he thought it was a tree, tall, gnarled, and dark. But trees didn't move, at least not like this. This thing was standing on two legs, its limbs too long and its body unnaturally thin, almost skeletal. Its head turned toward him, and Ethan felt a jolt of adrenaline as he realized it wasn't an animal. It wasn't human either. The creature let out a sound, almost like a growl, and Ethan's training took over. He dropped into a defensive stance, pulling his knife from its sheath. "Scout," he called, his voice steady but firm. There was no answer. The creature stepped closer, moving with a jerky, unnatural gait. Its eyes glowed faintly in the fading light like embers. Ethan didn't wait to see what it would do. He slowly backed away, keeping his knife between him and the thing. His heart pounded in his chest, but his movements were calm, measured. Then just as he reached the edge of the clearing, he heard a faint sound behind him. He spun, his knife raised, and found himself face to face with Scout. The dog was trembling, his tail tucked between his legs, but he was unharmed. Ethan grabbed Scout by the collar, his eyes flicking back to the clearing. The creature was gone. Ethan didn't waste any time. He and Scout headed back down the trail, his head on a swivel the entire way. Every shadow seemed to move. Every crack of a branch made him tense. He didn't stop until he reached his truck, parked at the edge of the woods. As he drove home, Scout curled up in the passenger seat, still shaking. Ethan's hands were tight on the wheel. He didn't know what he'd seen, and he wasn't sure he wanted to know. It wasn't like anything he'd encountered during his tours, and he'd seen some strange things overseas. That night, as he sat on his porch, Scout lying at his feet, Ethan couldn't stop worrying that whatever was in those woods had followed him. He kept scanning the perimeter of his yard, waiting for movement, but nothing came. Over the next few weeks, Ethan noticed small things: scratches on the side of his house, strange footprints in the dirt near his property line, and the sound of something heavy moving through the woods late at night. He never went back to the old logging road, and he made sure Scout stayed close to home and didn't wander from his sight. Ethan had survived war zones and firefights, But this was something entirely new. This was something that defied logic and couldn't be explained. There was no enemy to fight, no mission to complete, just an unshakable sense that something was watching and waiting. And no matter how much he tries to convince himself it is over, he just can't get past the fear. Jason worked as a security guard in Cleveland, patrolling warehouses and empty lots at odd hours. So he was used to the quiet and the dark. But that night, the one he couldn't stop replaying in his head, made him question just how much he'd ever really understood about the world. It started like any other shift. He was covering the old East 55th scrapyard on Cleveland's industrial edge. The area wasn't well lit, just a few scattered floodlights and a flashlight that barely cut through the heavy, damp air. Jason parked his car at the gate and started his rounds. He'd done this route a dozen times, walking the gravel paths between piles of rusted-out cars and stacks of scrap metal. Nothing ever happened here. Maybe a raccoon or a stray cat would startle him now and then, but that was it. Around 1:30 a.m., Jason was halfway through his patrol when he heard it, a sharp metallic clang, like someone dropped a pipe or kicked a loose piece of machinery. He jumped and then swept his flashlight toward the sound but didn't see anything. Probably just the wind, he muttered to himself, but he felt uneasy. The scrapyard was surrounded by a high fence and the gate was locked tight behind him. No one should have been in there. Jason decided to check it out more closely. He followed the sound toward a cluster of stacked car shells. The air felt colder as he got closer. He noticed how quiet everything was. Even the distant hum of the freeway seemed muted. His flashlight beam wavered over the twisted metal, casting weird shadows that made him feel like someone was moving just out of view. When he reached the source of the noise, he saw what looked like claw marks on the side of a rusted-out van. 4 deep gouges ran diagonally across the metal, as if something had raked it with oversized talons. Jason crouched down to get a closer look, his pulse quickening. The marks weren't fresh, but they weren't old either. They gleamed faintly, as if whatever made them had done so recently enough to leave a trace. That's when he felt it, a presence. You know how you can sometimes tell when someone's watching you, even if you can't see them? That's what it was like. The hair on the back of his neck stood up. Jason straightened, swinging his flashlight around in a slow arc. At first, he didn't see anything. Then his beam landed on it. Eyes, reflective, like an animal's, but higher off the ground than any animal he'd ever seen. They blinked once, twice, and then the thing stepped forward, just enough for him to make out its silhouette. It was tall, easily 7 or 8 feet, and hunched in a way that made its movements seem jerky, almost unnatural. Its limbs were long and thin, and its skin, or fur, or whatever it was, seemed to absorb the light from his flashlight. His first thought wasn't to run or scream. It was this weird, detached kind of curiosity, like his brain hadn't caught up to the situation yet. He'd heard stories about weird things people claimed to see in the woods or on lonely roads, but he never believed them. Now he was staring at something that shouldn't exist, and all he could think was, "What the hell am I looking at?" Then it moved, fast, too fast for something that size. One second it was 20 feet away, and the next it was 10. Jason stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a loose pipe. His instincts kicked in, and he did the only thing he could think of. He aimed his flashlight at its face. The beam hit those reflective eyes, and the thing recoiled, letting out a sound Jason could only describe as a mix between a growl and a scream. It was loud enough to make his ears ring, and for a second he thought he might pass out. But the light worked. The thing backed off, retreating into the shadows, though Jason could still hear it circling him, its movements punctuated by the crunch of gravel underfoot. Jason didn't waste time. He bolted. He ran back toward his car, flashlight bouncing wildly in his hand. He could still hear it following him, but it wasn't running, it was stalking him, staying just out of sight, but close enough that he could feel it. The gate came into view, and for a moment, he thought he might actually make it out. That's when he tripped. His foot caught on a piece of debris and he went down hard, his flashlight skittering out of reach. Pain shot through his knee, but he didn't have time to think about it. He scrambled toward the flashlight, his hand scraping against the gravel. As his fingers closed around it, he heard the thing again. Closer this time. It was breathing, a deep, guttural sound that sent a chill down his spine. Jason swung the flashlight toward the noise, but before he could see anything, the light flickered and went out. He cursed under his breath, fumbling with the flashlight, smacking it against his palm. The breathing got louder. He felt something brush against his leg, something cold and rough like sandpaper. He swung blindly, his flashlight connecting with something solid. The thing let out another scream, this one higher pitched, almost pained. The flashlight flickered back on just long enough for Jason to see it retreating again, melting into the darkness. He didn't wait to see if it would come back. He got up, limped to the gate, and practically threw himself into his car. He didn't even bother locking the gate behind him. He just started the engine and drove. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely keep the wheel steady. He didn't stop until he was back in his apartment. Every light in the place turned on. He didn't sleep that night or the next. Jason didn't report what happened. What would he even say? That he saw what? A monster? No one would believe him. He wasn't sure he believed it himself, but every time he thought about going back to that scrapyard, he felt the same cold knot of fear in his stomach. He quit his job a week later. He tried to move on, to convince himself it was just a weird shadow. But sometimes, late at night, he'd hear that scream in his head, and he'd feel the same chill he felt in the scrapyard, and he'd wonder if it was still out there, waiting to show itself again. He tried to push it from his mind, but it's been a tough pill to swallow. Do any of you have any thoughts on what he encountered? Maggie always enjoyed her late-night drives. They were her way of clearing her head after a long day, especially after closing up the diner where she worked in the small town of White River, Arkansas. The roads were quiet, the stars seemed brighter out in the countryside, and the cool air coming through her rolled-down window was the perfect way to unwind. It was just her, the hum of her old truck. That particular night, she decided to take the long way home, a winding 2-lane road that cut through the dense woods surrounding the White River Wildlife Refuge. She liked that stretch of road, even if it was a little eerie. The trees closed in overhead, forming a tunnel that blocked out most of the moonlight, but she liked it. It was peaceful. Around midnight, as she rounded a bend, her headlights caught something up ahead on the road. It was hunched over just at the edge of the asphalt, and she slowed down instinctively, not wanting to hit it. But as she got closer, she realized it wasn't anything normal. The figure was too tall, its limbs too long. It looked like it was crouched over something, its back arched unnaturally, almost like a spider. Maggie hit the brakes, her truck coming to a stop about 20 feet away. The thing didn't move at first. It just stayed there, hunched over whatever it was eating or examining in the middle of the road. She reached for her phone, thinking she'd take a picture, but her hand froze. Something about the way it moved made her stomach turn. It wasn't like an animal. It was too deliberate, almost human-like, but off, like it was trying to mimic a person and failing. The thing finally noticed her. It turned its head slowly, almost unnaturally slow, and Maggie saw its face, or what should have been its face. The headlights illuminated hollow sockets where eyes should have been, and a mouth that was too wide, with teeth that gleamed like broken glass. It tilted its head, as if studying her, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Maggie's fight-or-flight instinct kicked in, and she slammed the truck into reverse, her tires screeching as she backed up. The thing stood up, unfolding itself to its full height, which had to be at least 7 feet. It took a step toward her, its gait jerky and unsteady like it wasn't used to walking. Her reverse gear maxed out, and she had no choice but to slam on the brakes and shift into drive. But as she did, the thing darted off the road and disappeared into the woods. Maggie hesitated for a split second, torn between flooring it and getting out of there or staying put to see if it came back. Her heart was pounding and her hands were slick on the wheel. Just as she decided to leave, she caught movement in her peripheral vision. She turned her head, and there it was, running alongside her truck, parallel to the road but within the trees. Maggie hit the gas, her truck lurching forward, but no matter how fast she went, the thing kept pace. She could only see it in flashes, its pale form flickering between the trees like a ghost. She sped up, her speedometer climbing past 60, then 70, but the thing didn't slow down. If anything, it was getting closer. Its movements were horrifyingly fast, almost like it was gliding or flying rather than running. Maggie's chest tightened as she realized she might not be able to outrun it. The road curved sharply, and she nearly lost control, her tires skidding on the gravel shoulder before she corrected. When she looked back toward the woods, the thing was gone. She didn't know if that was better or worse. Maggie kept driving, her foot pressing harder on the gas pedal with every mile. She didn't let up until she saw the lights of a gas station up ahead. The neon glow felt like a lifeline, and she pulled into the lot, her tires screeching as she came to a stop. The station was empty except for the clerk inside, a teenager with earbuds in who didn't even look up as she stumbled through the door. Maggie leaned against the counter, trying to catch her breath. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely pull out her wallet. "You okay?" the clerk finally asked, pulling out one of his earbuds. "Yeah," she lied. "Just a long drive." She grabbed a bottle of water from the cooler and sat down at one of the small plastic tables near the window. She told herself she'd wait there for a while, let her nerves settle before heading home. But as she sipped the water, her eyes kept darting to the window, scanning the trees just beyond the edge of the parking lot. About 20 minutes passed, and she started convincing herself that maybe it was over. Maybe whatever that thing was had moved on. She tossed the empty water bottle in the trash and stood up to leave. That's when she heard it, a soft tapping sound, like fingernails against glass. Maggie froze. The sound came again, and this time she saw it. The thing was outside, pressed up against the glass of the station's front door. Its hollow socket stared directly at her, and its mouth twisted into a grin that was all wrong. She screamed, stumbling backward and knocking over a chair. The clerk looked up, confused, but by the time he turned toward the door, the thing was gone. "You okay, lady?" he asked, but Maggie didn't answer. She grabbed her keys and ran back to her truck, locking the doors and peeling out of the lot without looking back. When she got home, she parked her truck as close to the house as possible and bolted inside, locking every door and window. She didn't sleep that night, and for weeks afterward. She also started to avoid that stretch of road. She told herself it was just her brain screwing around with her, and tried to convince herself that she had been overtired or that her mind had exaggerated whatever she'd seen. But every once in a while, late at night, she'd hear that same soft tapping sound on her bedroom window. She never did open the curtains to check. Months later, Maggie thought she had moved on. But then, every so often, she'd wake in the middle of the night to a sound she couldn't explain. The faintest tapping at her window or the creak of footsteps on her porch. Each time she stayed frozen in bed, holding her breath until the noises stopped. She never worked up the courage to look outside and still sleeps with all the curtains drawn. Anyone have any help for her? Beneath some of the most iconic landscapes in America, Yellowstone, the Grand Canyon, the Appalachian wilderness, there lies a secret. For over a century, whispers have circulated about a discovery made in the late 1800s, a discovery that wasn't meant to reach the public. Explorers, miners, and surveyors stumbled upon something buried deep in the earth, vast networks of tunnels stretching for miles. At first glance, some seemed natural, lava tubes, ancient caves, but others were too precise, too deliberate, as if designed by hands far older than any known civilization. Stranger still, many of these discoveries were quietly forgotten, their entrances sealed or left unmarked. The few accounts that survived are vague, fragmented, mentioning smooth walls, markings no one could decipher, and an eerie, unshakable feeling that something was watching from the dark. Why were these tunnels ignored? Or perhaps the better question is, why were they buried? And who's been keeping the full truth hidden? Stay tuned as we learn more and later hear from family members of park rangers, miners, and park visitors who experienced these strange phenomena in person. These tunnels were first discovered in the late 1800s. A team of miners stumbled upon a strange tunnel system near what is now Grand Canyon National Park. Initial reports described it as a subterranean corridor stretching for miles, unnaturally smooth, as though shaped by tools rather than nature. The miners, employed by a government-funded expedition, reported hearing strange echoes, sounds they couldn't explain. The president at the time, William McKinley, allegedly received a report detailing the miners' findings. According to a memo unearthed decades later, the tunnels were deemed of strategic importance and swiftly classified. The entrance was said to have been sealed and its location erased from official maps. Yet despite the government's swift action to bury these discoveries, both literally and figuratively, the stories didn't disappear. They lingered, passed down through families and locals who lived near these wilderness areas. The miners who stumbled upon these tunnels may have had to abandon their claims, but their memories remained strong. Some shared what they discovered in letters or diaries, while others spoke cautiously to those they trusted. One of those voices belongs to Margaret Harper, whose great-great-grandfather, William Harper, was among the first to encounter one of these mysterious underground labyrinths. Margaret's account offers a rare, chilling glimpse into what her family has carried in silence for generations.
I wasn't sure if I should talk about this. My dad always said it was a family thing and basically avoided the subject, like something we don't share with outsiders. But I guess I'm getting old enough now that maybe it's time someone else knows. Someone should know if you ask me. My great-grandpa, Bill Harper was his name. He was just a young man then, in his 20s. He'd come out west looking for gold, like so many others. He and a few others, about 6 of them, I think, were digging in this canyon just outside what we now call Grand Canyon National Park. Anyway, one day, they found it. The tunnel, he always said it wasn't like anything natural. It wasn't a mine shaft or a cave. The walls were, I think the word he used was polished. Smooth as glass, he said. And the floor, flat. Just flat, like something you'd see in a building. But he said it didn't look like it was made for people. The ceiling was too low in spots, and then other places opened up into these chambers. That's what he called them, chambers. I don't know everything about what he found in there. My dad said great-grandpa didn't like talking about it much. Said it was bad luck. But there was one thing he mentioned that stuck with me. He said there were marks on the walls, symbols almost like writing, but not any kind of writing he'd ever seen. He told the others they should leave it alone. He said it gave him a bad feeling, but they didn't listen. They kept going further in, and that's when they heard it. The noises. Great-grandpa said it sounded like whispers, but not whispers you could make out. It was like words just at the edge of your hearing, but you couldn't tell what they meant or where they were coming from. He said it wasn't like echoes. It was like the sound was was coming from the walls themselves, like the stone was alive somehow. They wanted to leave right then, but one of the men, Charlie, the youngest one, he kept saying they were so close to something. He could feel it, said they'd be fools to walk away now. Great-grandpa didn't want to fight him, so they went a little deeper. And that's when they found the first, chamber, they called it. He said the room was wrong. It was too perfect. Perfectly round, perfectly smooth. Like it wasn't made for people, like it wasn't made for anything that walks this earth. And in the middle, there was something, a pedestal maybe? Or a table. He didn't have the words for it, but he said it wasn't empty. There was something sitting on it. He didn't describe what it was, just said it didn't belong. That's when the whispers got louder. Charlie touched it. Whatever that thing was, he touched it. Great-grandpa said the air changed. It got heavy, thick, like they were breathing through wet cloth. And then they heard something else. Not whispers this time, something bigger. Footsteps maybe, but not like any footsteps they'd heard before. He said it was like the stone itself was moving, shifting, groaning, like it was waking up. They ran. They didn't talk, didn't argue. They just ran as fast as they could. When they got to the surface, Great-grandpa said he could still hear the whispers, faint but clear, following them up into the open air. They sealed the entrance that same day, piled rocks, dirt, anything they could find, but Charlie, he went back the next morning, said he had to know what it was, had to see it again. The others begged him not to go, but he wouldn't listen. They never saw him again. When he didn't come back, they went looking, but all they found was his pack lying just outside the entrance. It was like the earth swallowed him whole. After that, the rest of them left, packed up their camp, and didn't look back. Great-grandpa never went back either, but he couldn't leave it behind, not really. My dad always said it marked him somehow, like, something followed him out. He couldn't sleep right for years. He'd wake up in the middle of the night sweating, swearing he heard those whispers again, even in his own house. And when he was dying, he couldn't stop mumbling about the tunnels. He couldn't remember his name anymore, but he remembered them. He said they were still there waiting, and he begged us not to go looking. He was adamant in saying that some things are meant to stay buried.
Margaret Harper's account is haunting, her family forever touched by the secrets surrounding that discovery. But hers isn't the only story. As we delved deeper, we uncovered another voice, a man whose father, a park ranger in the 1940s, stumbled upon a similar tunnel during his patrols in Yellowstone. His experience would remain a mystery until strange events began to unravel after his sudden disappearance decades later. In 1947, deep within Yellowstone's boundaries, a park ranger named Thomas Givens filed an unusual report about an unmarked cave he had come across during a routine patrol. His notes were brief but curious. The entrance was larger than a typical cave, and he described the interior as eerily symmetrical, with surfaces that didn't match the natural geology of the area. Givens noted faint sounds, like wind, but more rhythmic, as if something unseen was moving within. He marked the location and returned to the station, intending to lead a small team back the next day. But Thomas Givens never came back. His horse returned to the station riderless, and search parties combed the area for days. All they found was his patrol pack, empty and abandoned, just a few hundred yards from the cave's entrance. Officially, his disappearance was attributed to an accident, likely a fall into an unseen ravine. But over the years, rumors began to surface. Other rangers reported strange phenomena near the area, odd sounds, feelings of being watched, and even glimpses of flickering lights deep in the trees at night. The entrance to the cave was eventually sealed, its location omitted from maps, and the story of Thomas Givens faded into the park's many mysteries. However, the story doesn't end there. Thomas Givens left behind a son, David, who has spent years trying to piece together the truth about his father's disappearance. And next up, David shares what he's uncovered and the chilling legacy that his father left behind.
My dad never came home that day. I was just a kid, maybe 10, and I remember sitting on the porch waiting for him. He'd promised we'd go fishing when he got back. I stayed out there till it got dark. I could hear Mom inside, pacing back and forth. She always did that when she was worried. When the next morning came around, the whole town, everyone, they all started saying the same thing. You know, that he must have had an accident out there, that he'd fallen into a ravine or something like that. They sent out search parties, lots of them, but they didn't find anything. No sign of him, no sign at all. Just his horse. His horse came back on its own, right to the ranger station. Saddle was still on, but the saddlebags, they were empty, completely empty. They called it an accident. That's what the official report says anyway. But my mom, she never believed that. And honestly, neither did I. Something about it, about all of it, it just didn't feel right. It didn't add up. It wasn't until years later, after my mom passed, that I found something that made me question everything I thought I knew. I was cleaning out her things, going through old boxes, and there was this one box stuffed way in the back of a closet. It was taped shut like it hadn't been touched in years. Inside, there were all these bits and pieces of Dad's life, old ranger patches, faded maps, things like that. And then, at the very bottom, there it was. His notebook. I'd never seen it before. Not once. It wasn't the kind of logbook he used for work, though. This one, it was personal. The cover was all worn out, and the pages, some of them were torn, smudged, like it had been carried through rough weather. But here's the thing. I don't know how it got back to the house. That's the part I can't explain. I know he had it with him that day. I remember watching him pack it in his bag before he left for his patrol. So how did it end up in that box? How? When I opened it, most of the entries were just his usual stuff. Trails, animal sightings, notes about the weather. But the last few pages, those were different. He wrote about something he found that day, and an unmarked cave he'd never seen before. He said the entrance, it looked like it had been hidden deliberately, like someone, or something, had covered it with rocks and underbrush. He described the inside as strange, not natural. The walls were smooth, like they'd been carved, not eroded, and the floor, he said it was too flat, too perfect, and the air inside, he said it felt wrong, heavy, cold, and this was summer, middle of summer. He mentioned hearing something too, not wind, not water dripping, something else. He said it was faint at first, like a low hum, but the deeper he went, the more it changed. He wrote that it started to sound like voices. Not words he could make out, just whispers. Quiet, but constant. And he said the strangest part, the scariest part, was that it didn't sound like it was coming from one place. He said it was all around him, like the walls themselves were breathing, like they were alive. The last thing he wrote, his voice falters and he looks down at his hands. It was just 4 words, scrawled in handwriting so shaky it didn't even look like his. He wrote, "It knows I'm here." And that's it. That's where it ends. No explanation, no follow-up, just those words. I don't know what happened after that. I don't think I want to know, but I think whatever he found in that cave, it didn't want him to leave. And somehow, Somehow, his notebook came back, like it wanted to be found, or maybe it was a warning. I really wish I knew how my mom got it. I've spent years trying to find that cave. I've gone through every old map, every record I could get my hands on, but it's like it never existed. It's not on any of the park files. It's not in the search reports. It's just gone. And you know what scares me the most? It's like someone wanted it that way. Like someone went out of their way to make sure no one would ever find it again. But I know it's still out there, and I don't think my dad was the only one who's gone missing because of it. I think there's something buried in these parks that we're not supposed to find. Something they don't want us to know about.
David Givens' story raises chilling questions. What did his father stumble across in that cave? And why, after all these years, has every trace of it seemingly vanished? It's not the kind of story you expect to hear about America's national parks, places we think of as serene and untouched. But his account isn't the only one. For more than a century, stories have trickled out. Stories of strange, unmarked tunnels buried beneath the surface of places like Yellowstone, the Grand Canyon, even the Appalachian wilderness. And what makes these accounts stand out? The details, the unnaturally smooth walls, the symbols carved into the stone, the eerie sensations described by those who found them. Scientists and geologists have explanations. Lava tubes, ancient river systems, natural formations carved by time. But when we look closer, there's a pattern. These tunnels aren't just natural anomalies. They appear where no one expects them, in locations that weren't supposed to exist. And the deeper people go, the stranger the accounts become. Theories range from the plausible to the extraordinary. Some researchers have speculated these tunnels could be remnants of an ancient civilization, one far older than the cultures we've recorded in history books. A civilization that may have known how to carve through the earth with precision we can't replicate today. But others suggest something darker. What if these tunnels were never built for human use? What if they weren't abandoned at all? David Givens' father wrote in his final log, "It knows I'm here." What does that mean? Was he being watched? Was something following him? And if the notebooks, the whispers, and the strange disappearances are connected, who or what was trying to keep him out? To dig deeper, we reached out, even to family members of those who vanished under similar circumstances. The deeper we searched, the more unsettling the picture became. Coming up next, the chilling account of a park historian who claims they've seen the tunnels firsthand and the disturbing discoveries they made inside.
I don't know if I should be talking about this. Honestly, I've spent years trying to forget it. But when you work in these parks long enough, you hear things, rumors, stories people don't want on record. Most of it I brushed off, figured it was just campfire talk, until I saw it for myself. It was about 15 years ago. I was cataloging some old maps from the early surveys of the park, Yellowstone specifically. Most of them were routine, topographical details, geological notes, that sort of thing. But there was one map. It caught my attention because it had a section that was blacked out. Not erased, just obscured, like someone didn't want it there. I'm not the kind of person to let something like that go, so I dug deeper. I found an accompanying report from 1878. It was vague, but there were just enough details to set me on edge. Something about a subterranean anomaly. I thought, maybe it's a cave system. Yellowstone has plenty of those, right? But the way it was described, it wasn't natural. Words like engineered, symmetrical, geometric, not what you'd expect from a cave. And then I found the coordinates, I shouldn't have gone. I know that now. But curiosity got the better of me. I took a week off, grabbed my gear, and headed out to the location. It was way off the trails, deep in the back country. It took me a couple of days just to get there. When I finally found it, I almost missed it. The entrance was hidden, completely covered by brush and fallen rocks. It looked like no one had been there in over a century. I don't know what I was expecting to find, but the second I stepped inside, I knew this wasn't just some cave. The walls, they were smooth, not perfectly, but like they'd been shaped, worked on. And there were these grooves along the sides, vertical lines that went straight up to the ceiling. It wasn't natural, I can tell you that. The floor was flat, almost like it had been leveled. The deeper I went, the stranger it got. There were markings, symbols carved into the walls, but nothing I recognized. They weren't letters or pictographs, just these strange looping designs that almost seemed to move if you stared at them too long. And then there was the sound. It started as a low hum, so faint I thought I was imagining it. But as I kept going, it grew louder. Not a sound, exactly. More like a vibration you could feel in your chest. And then it changed. It wasn't humming anymore, it was whispers. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds. I couldn't make out words, but I could swear they were coming from the walls, from the grooves in the stone. I'd shine my flashlight around, trying to see if there were cracks or crevices, but there was nothing. Just smooth stone. I should have turned back right then, but I didn't. I don't know why. It's like something was pulling me deeper. And then I found the chamber. It was massive, bigger than anything I'd expected. The ceiling vaulted up so high my flashlight couldn't reach it. In the center was this structure, like an altar or a pedestal, but it wasn't made of stone. It was metal or something like it. Black, smooth, cold to the touch. And that's when I saw it, the shadow. I know how it sounds. I 100% know. But there was something there, standing just beyond the edge of my light. I couldn't make out its shape. Just that it was tall, impossibly tall, and it moved. Slow, deliberate. I froze. I didn't know what to do. And then the whisper stopped, all at once, like someone flipped a switch. The silence was worse. It felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. And that's when I ran. I don't know how I made it out. I ran until my legs gave out. And when I finally looked back, the entrance was gone. Just gone. Like it had never been there. I spent the night in the woods, too scared to move. And when I finally made it back to civilization, I didn't tell anyone. I couldn't. But when I got home, there was something in my bag. A piece of that metal, the same black material from the chamber. I didn't put it there, I swear to you, I didn't. I don't even know how it got in my pack, but I knew right then that I'd made a mistake. I got rid of it, buried it miles away, somewhere no one will ever find it. But sometimes, late at night, I hear that hum again, or I think I do, and I wonder, did I really leave it behind, or did it follow me?
David Givens's father, Margaret Harper's great-grandfather, and even the anonymous park historian all describe the same thing, an otherworldly network of tunnels hidden beneath the most iconic landscapes in America, stories separated by decades, even centuries, yet somehow bound by similar details: smooth walls, strange markings, whispers in the dark. Are these tunnels a natural phenomenon? Anomalies shaped by volcanic activity, glacial movement, or the slow grind of erosion? That's what most experts would have us believe. But as the pieces of the puzzle come together, the natural explanations start to fall apart. There are those who suggest these tunnels were created by an ancient civilization, one that predates even the earliest known human settlements in North America. Could this be the same civilization that left behind the undeciphered markings found on canyon walls, or the mysterious petroglyphs etched into rock formations across the Southwest? Did they possess knowledge and tools lost to time, buried with their secrets beneath layers of stone? Then there's the theory of modern interference. Some believe the tunnels may not be ancient at all, but are the product of secret government operations. During the Cold War, rumors swirled about vast underground projects, hidden missile silos, bunkers, even transport systems buried deep beneath the surface. Could these tunnels be remnants of such operations, deliberately erased from public knowledge to keep the truth buried? But that explanation doesn't account for the stories that date back long before the government could have had the means to construct something on this scale. And it doesn't explain the disappearances, the whispers, or the unease that lingers long after the entrances are sealed. Some theorists take it further, suggesting these tunnels might not be entirely of this world. The strange markings, the unnatural geometry, the feeling of being watched, these have led some to speculate about extraterrestrial involvement. Were these tunnels carved by visitors from beyond our planet? And if so, are they abandoned relics, or are they still being used? Ultimately, the truth about the tunnels remains elusive. Those who encounter them often leave with more questions than answers. And for those who've dared to enter, the experience seems to follow them. A shadow that lingers, whispering its presence even decades later. Perhaps the tunnels are a reminder of how much we still don't know about the world beneath our feet. Or perhaps they're a warning, a boundary we were never meant to cross. I want to take you back to something that might seem unimportant at first. You hear about national parks all the time. You might visit them for a vacation, a day trip, or a chance to see wildlife. People think of them as peaceful places filled with natural wonders. They see tall trees, rushing rivers, and wide open meadows. Most of the time, that is all true. There is so much beauty in these places. Park rangers look after the land, help visitors, and make sure nobody disturbs the balance. We rarely suspect that something might be lurking beneath the surface, something strange that no one talks about. But every once in a while, a rumor starts to swirl. It might be an unusual sign posted at the edge of a restricted path, or a set of files tucked away in a drawer that no one has opened for decades. And sometimes, people find more than they bargained for. In this particular story, we're talking about Yellowstone National Park. Most people know Yellowstone for its geysers, hot springs, and wildlife. They know about Old Faithful, about the bison that sometimes block the roads, and about the beauty of the region. But if you spend enough time there, you hear whispers about odd research happening, sealed-off buildings, and documents that date back to times when federal agencies did all sorts of tests that were not always public knowledge. This story comes from a pair of park rangers who stumbled upon something that appears to confirm more than just rumors. They came across a set of documents, official-looking, and marked with signatures from agencies not normally associated with national parks. These pages suggested that, decades ago, there might have been secret testing conducted right in the midst of Yellowstone. The first ranger discovered locked files describing hidden sites and unexplained experiments. The second ranger found peculiar fences and mysterious equipment deep in the woods, places visitors never see. Park officials act like everything is normal, but these secret locations suggest otherwise. Why the hidden structures? Why the talk of chemicals and test subjects? And why are standard rangers kept in the dark? There's a sudden chill in the air when you consider what might be happening beyond the tourist trails. Tonight, we'll hear directly from both rangers. Their stories raise troubling questions about government-level research and how it could be shaping the future of this iconic park. They never asked for conspiracies or thrills. They just wanted to protect the land. Instead, they found locked gates, coded paperwork, and a quiet push to keep it all under wraps. Now they're breaking that silence to reveal what they saw lurking in the heart of Yellowstone National Park. The answers may shock you, and the full truth remains buried under layers of secrecy.
I've been a park ranger here in Yellowstone for about 10 years now, maybe a bit more. I can't say I ever expected anything beyond the usual routines, looking after trails, guiding tourists, and making sure folks don't wander too close to the bison. That kind of stuff, right? I never figured I'd end up stumbling onto some files that made me question everything I thought I knew about this place. So, let me start at the beginning. It was a normal weekday, and I was assigned to clean out one of the older storage areas beneath an administrative building. You know those old basements, concrete floors, flickering lights, dusty boxes stacked against the walls. I wasn't really expecting much. Maybe just old trail maps or outdated brochures. Honestly, I was just trying to get through the day so I could head back outside. Then I found this metal filing cabinet, kind of beat up, with a tiny lock on the top drawer. Now, I'm not usually one to pry, but the lock was so flimsy that a small tug popped it right open. Inside, I saw folders stamped with official seals, some from agencies I recognized, like the National Park Service logo. But there were others that looked different. They had codes I'd never seen, plus these black bars across certain words like someone had taken a thick marker and just scrubbed out all the details. I remember pausing and thinking, wait a minute, this looks, well, kind of restricted. But then I told myself that maybe it was just routine paperwork. We do get all kinds of documents sent in from different government departments. Still, the more I flipped through, the more I realized this wasn't everyday stuff. There were references to Site 4 and Site 7 and something called Project Tanglewood, though maybe it was spelled a bit differently. I couldn't be sure because half of it was blacked out. I saw phrases like exposure protocols and containment procedures, which made the hair on the back of my neck stand up a little. Let me tell you, I almost dropped those folders right there. But curiosity got the better of me. I was thinking, what do they mean by containment procedures in a national park? So I started taking pictures with my phone. I'm not proud of it, but I was worried if I tried to walk away with the folders, somebody might notice they were missing. At least with pictures, I had proof that I wasn't imagining all this. I saw one page referencing possible vectors among local fauna, and that honestly made me shiver, because if you work here, you know how critical it is to manage wildlife. But the language they used, it was so clinical, almost sterile, like they weren't studying bison or wolves, but test subjects. Then there were a few sketches or small maps with red circles. I couldn't tell exactly where they were, but the outlines vaguely matched parts of Yellowstone I'd patrolled a few times. Now I decided to keep this under wraps until I could figure out exactly what was going on. I closed up the drawer, locked it as best I could, and tried to put everything back the way I found it. My heart was pounding. I mean, real adrenaline spike. I kept thinking, am I supposed to see this? Or could this jeopardize my job? That night, I went home, and I just couldn't sleep. I zoomed in on the pictures on my phone, reading all the little details. There was a section mentioning government liaison teams and something about restricted vantage points. I couldn't make heads or tails of it, but I knew it wasn't normal research. A few days later, I decided, okay, if these maps point to actual spots in the park, maybe I can see if anything's out there. I couldn't get it off my mind. You know how sometimes you just can't rest until you check for yourself? So on my next day off, I grabbed a personal backpack and drove to the area I thought might match one of those circled locations. It was a pretty remote corner of Yellowstone, away from the main loops where tourists usually drive. Now let me tell you, the roads out there are rough. After a few miles, I had to park and hike the rest of the way. It was quiet, no campers, no signs of anyone else around. Then, out of nowhere, I saw this chain link fence. It wasn't the usual wooden fence we use for guiding visitors or protecting delicate geyser areas. This was tall, industrial, and had a big padlock on the gate. The sign read something like, "Restricted area, authorized personnel only." But it didn't have the official park seal. It was just a generic warning sign. That made me pause. I thought, what on earth is this fence doing here? I've never heard of us restricting this area. I know most of the official closures for safety reasons, like unstable ground or thermal features, but this didn't match any of those. Still, I couldn't just turn around. I felt I needed to see more. So I walked the perimeter and found a spot where the fence met a rocky slope and there was a slight gap underneath. Honestly, my nerves were on edge. It felt like crossing a line I wasn't supposed to cross, but something told me I had to check it out. Once I got through that gap, I saw a small clearing a few hundred yards away. In the clearing was a squat building. Looked like a prefabricated structure with no windows. I'd never seen anything like it in the park. Park buildings usually have identifying marks, or at least some historical reason for being there. This was just anonymous. The door appeared reinforced, and there was some kind of vent on the side. That vent was humming, like a generator or an air filtration system was running inside. I was tempted to go right up to it, but at that moment I heard voices. I ducked behind a bush. I saw two people wearing dark jackets step out from behind the building. They were carrying what looked like sealed containers, metal cases with bright orange stripes. They didn't look like typical park employees, no badges or patches, and the gear was more high-tech than anything I'd seen around here. They said something I couldn't make out, then walked toward a pickup truck hidden under a camouflage tarp. That's when my heart started racing. I mean, who hides a truck under a tarp in a restricted area? I stayed still for a few minutes until they drove off. Then I inched closer. I noticed a small drainage pipe on the side of the building, trickling some kind of cloudy water into a shallow ditch. The smell was, I don't know how to describe it. Not quite sulfur, not quite bleach, but definitely chemical. I didn't dare touch it. My mind just kept going back to those words in the files. Containment, exposures, test subjects. I couldn't believe this was happening in a national park. Yellowstone is supposed to be protected land, right? So why all the secrecy? Why the unmarked building and the crates that look more at home in a government lab? It made me feel like I'd stumbled into a bigger operation than anything I'd imagined. And I'll admit, I was scared. I'm just one ranger. I'm not a detective or a special agent. This was way out of my comfort zone. Eventually, I left. I took a few pictures from a distance, but I didn't dare get too close. I kept thinking, what if those people come back and see me snooping around? Do they have authority to arrest me, or worse? So I slipped back under the fence and hiked until I felt safe again. The entire time, my mind buzzed with questions about what exactly I'd just seen. After I calmed down, I tried asking around discreetly. Most folks just shrugged or said they had no idea about any hidden building. One senior official told me there were sometimes joint research projects in Yellowstone, but he didn't elaborate. It felt like a brush-off. And every time I tried to bring up the suspicious details, like the padlocked fence and the chemicals, people either changed the subject or gave me a vague explanation about environmental data gathering. No one had a straight answer, which only made me more uneasy. At that point, I realized I needed to keep quiet until I knew who I could trust. I still have the photos on my phone, though I haven't shown them to anyone officially. I did confide in one close colleague, and that person said something like, "I've heard rumors, but I never thought it was real." And that was it. No follow-up, no attempt to investigate together. It's almost like no one wants to rock the boat. So that's where I'm at. I found these strange documents. I matched them to a real location. I saw a building that doesn't officially exist, with people who definitely aren't standard park staff. I saw something that sure looks like chemicals draining into the soil, and I have no idea how far up this goes, or if there are more sites like it scattered around Yellowstone. Honestly, I don't know if sharing my story will make any difference, but I can't pretend I didn't see what I saw. The park belongs to everyone, and I've always believed in protecting it. Yet it's hard to protect something when you don't even know what's lurking in your own backyard. So, yeah, I'm worried. I'm worried about the wildlife, about the visitors, and about what happens if there's a leak or an accident nobody's prepared to handle. And I'm also worried about stepping on the wrong toes if I push too hard for answers. But I do know this. If these hidden activities are real, and I have no reason to doubt what my eyes saw, then we might only be seeing the tip of a very large iceberg. And that's a thought that keeps me up at night. I keep wondering who else knows, or if I'm just one of the few unlucky enough to put the clues together. Either way, I'm speaking up now because, well, I think the truth deserves to be out there, even if it's hidden behind fences and blacked out documents in a dusty basement.
Our first ranger's discovery of classified documents, sudden references to covert experiments, and hidden locations raised enough questions to shake any seasoned park employee. Yet that wasn't the end of the trail. Another ranger working a seemingly ordinary patrol stumbled onto evidence that those files were more than just faded words on paper. While exploring a remote part of the park, far from common tourist paths, this second ranger noticed footprints in a place where human traffic is virtually non-existent. The tracks led to a fence that didn't match any standard park enclosure. Beyond it lay a small, unmarked structure. No sign, no official emblem, just walls of corrugated metal. Standing there, the ranger heard a persistent mechanical hum from inside, the kind you'd expect from generators or heavy equipment. At first glance, it didn't look abandoned, and it certainly wasn't on any ranger maps. The sense of being watched, combined with that steady drone, created an unease that wouldn't go away. But is this site tied to the documents the first ranger found? Those cryptic references to test subjects and off-limits data? Could both situations be part of a single secret operation stretching across Yellowstone's hidden corners? Let's hear the second ranger's first-hand account. The eerie details may confirm just how real and how active these hidden installations truly are.
I've been a ranger here in Yellowstone for a few years now, but to tell you the truth, I still feel new, honestly, especially compared to some of the veterans. Most of the time, my job's pretty straightforward since I'm newer. Check a trail, talk to visitors, that sort of thing. But not too long ago, I stumbled on something I just can't shake off. and I don't feel comfortable knowing about it. I was out on a patrol, right? Nothing unusual, just me, my backpack, and a map. The trail I was on suddenly veered off, or maybe it just sort of ended. I'm not sure. Either way, I found myself walking into this denser patch of trees, and that's when I noticed a fence. A tall metal fence, not the typical wooden kind we use to block off areas for safety. This one looked serious, kind of industrial. I thought, that's odd. I don't remember hearing about any restricted zone in this area. So I got closer, and there was this sign, big letters that said restricted area or something like that, but no official park logo, no mention of the National Park Service, nothing. It was just a generic sign telling people to stay out. I stood there kind of dumbfounded because as far as I knew, there wasn't supposed to be anything out here. It's not on my map. It's not in any briefing I've had. So I walked along the fence to see if there was an opening or a gate. Eventually, I found a small gap near a bunch of rocks, probably where the fence didn't meet the ground perfectly. I know I shouldn't have, but I was too curious, so I slipped underneath. A few minutes in, I came across this small clearing. Right in the middle of the clearing was a metal shed. No sign on the door, no windows, just a solid metal shed that looked new, or at least maintained. I could hear this low hum. It wasn't loud, but once you noticed it, it was impossible to ignore. I thought, why would anyone build this here and not tell the rangers? I mean, we're supposed to know about every building in Yellowstone, especially something that's fenced off. Then I caught this strange odor, kind of chemical. Not super strong, but enough to make me notice. My first reaction was to check around, see if there were signs of a spill or something. Instead, I saw a thick cable running from the shed into the ground, like it was pulling power from somewhere else. That's when I started to feel uneasy. I was alone, way off the usual trails. No radio signal either. If something went wrong, nobody would even know where to look for me. I decided to take a quick photo with my phone just in case. But then I heard what sounded like footsteps, or maybe it was rustling. Whatever it was, it felt like someone was coming around the corner of the shed. I panicked for a second, thinking, if these folks are here doing something secretive, they might not be thrilled to find me snooping around. So I crouched behind a tree and waited. A few seconds later, I saw a person walk out, wearing dark clothing with no patches or name tags. They seemed to be carrying a clipboard, or maybe a tablet, I'm not sure. I couldn't see any identifying marks. They looked around like they were checking the perimeter, then walked back inside. My heart was pounding. I wanted to ask them what was going on, but something told me it'd be better to leave. I mean, clearly this wasn't standard park business, and I didn't want to risk a confrontation. When I finally got back to familiar territory, I tried to calm down and think rationally. Maybe it's some sort of research project, but if it was legit, we'd have records, right? And we'd have signage with the park's logo, or at least a notice to staff. Something. This was just nothing, no official footprint at all. Over the next couple of days, I poked around the station, casually asking if anybody knew about new research sites. Everyone just shook their heads. I haven't told many people about this. Most wouldn't believe me anyway, or they'd tell me to just mind my own business. But I can't forget that hum, that cable, that chemical smell. Clearly something was going on. And that figure I saw? They didn't look like any ranger I've ever worked with. I still think about it every time I patrol that side of the park. Part of me wants to go back and see if it's still there, or if there's more than one of these sheds. Another part of me worries about what would happen if I did, because honestly, this feels bigger than anything I'm trained for, and I'm guessing someone really doesn't want folks poking their nose in. I don't know if it's government testing or some private company's secret research, but it makes me uneasy, like really uneasy. If they're storing chemicals or running experiments in the heart of Yellowstone that could affect wildlife, water sources, even park visitors, and we, the rangers, are left in the dark, that just doesn't sit right with me. So that's it. That's what happened. I wish I had clearer answers. All I have are questions and a few photos. I'm too scared to show anyone higher up, but I can't just forget it. It's like this nagging feeling that something's happening out there, hidden behind a locked fence in a place that most folks will never even know exists. And I'm still not sure how to handle that.
Both rangers uncovered alarming secrets lurking just below Yellowstone's scenic surface: classified documents, off-limits structures, and mysterious gear that points to a carefully orchestrated operation. The clues tie back to agencies that avoid public scrutiny and leave park employees in the dark, suggesting that something far from ordinary is unfolding right under everyone's noses. Why would anyone hide a research facility in the country's most famous national park? Some speculate it's for disease control, where certain pathogens could be tested in a real-world environment without tipping off visitors. Others believe it's about wildlife experimentation, introducing chemicals or biological agents to see how bison, wolves, or even Yellowstone's geothermal systems react. A darker theory points to military involvement, where the seclusion of the park provides a perfect setting for top-secret field trials or technology tests. The government's tight-lipped stance only fuels suspicion. Official documents are heavily redacted, and any mention of test subjects or exposure protocols is carefully blacked out. The rangers who've dared to ask questions got vague reassurances or outright dismissals with no follow-up. For them, the unnerving part isn't just the presence of hidden labs and fences. It's the sense that someone with high-level authority actively wants to keep it all quiet. With each discovery, new questions emerge. Is there an ongoing risk to unsuspecting tourists? Are animals being altered in ways that could disrupt the park's ecosystem? And most chilling of all, what happens if something goes wrong in one of these concealed research zones? The silence from above suggests we may never get straightforward answers. Instead, the park's usual tranquility is overshadowed by the possibility of a hush-hush project, something big enough and secretive enough to stay off the record, even in a place as watched and studied as Yellowstone National Park. The thought lingers. If this is just what two rangers happen to stumble upon, what deeper layers of secrecy might remain buried in the wilderness? I'm writing this message to you in a single go, since everything's been rattling around in my head. Usually, I'd go through official channels, or I'd meticulously organize my thoughts into bullet points and references. But given the circumstances, I figure it's best to speak freely. For context, I used to roll my eyes whenever someone mentioned secret government projects, but after what I've witnessed within the Department of Energy's headquarters, I'm done scoffing. I'm talking about hushed corridors, off-limits stairwells, and the kind of after-hours activity that has scared the crap out of me. So here it is, all of it, jumbled, raw, and typed out in a rush. If you think I'm another conspiracy nut, just keep listening. Because once you see what I've seen, you might never dismiss these stories again. So I've worked at the James V. Forrestal Building in Washington, D.C. That's the main headquarters for the Department of Energy, for the better part of 6 years now. I started in a fairly standard capacity, budget analysis and some oversight on environmental management programs. Nothing flashy. Nothing that would typically put me in contact with anything even remotely clandestine. In my first few years, it was just office life. Daily commutes on the metro, morning coffee runs, typical internal departmental politics, the usual stuff. But about a year ago, I started noticing details that seemed out of place. At first, it just felt like old building quirks. You know how old government buildings can have entire sections that feel like labyrinths, basement levels, sub-basements, and locked storage rooms that no one seems to need until an annual inspection rolls around. I would see, for example, sealed corridors with no admittance signs that weren't in the main part of the building. But that wasn't too weird. I mean, all big agencies have secured areas, right? So I didn't really question it much beyond some mild curiosity. Sometime around last December, I started hearing rumors from a coworker named Gil, that's not his real name, of course, who handles some after-hours security checks. He told me in passing, almost like an offhand remark, that he was hearing weird noises at night. He said it sounded like scuttling or scraping in the hallways that should have been empty. Gil is one of those old-timers, used to be in the Navy, has seen a lot in life. I remember him saying something like, "Look, I've done my rounds in the dead of night for 3 years, and I know what normal sounds like. This is not normal." He also mentioned that certain areas, especially near the lower floors, just gave him the creeps in a way he never used to feel. It stuck with me but didn't set off major alarms at the time. I joked with him about rats or something messing around in the ventilation system. He gave me this serious look and said sternly, "This ain't rats." That was the first real sign that something was off. Not long after that conversation, the building began implementing new protocols without explanation. We all got these departmental memos stating that certain sections on the sub-basement levels were now off-limits unless you had a newly issued pass with specific clearance codes. Even for staff like me with a moderate security clearance, it wasn't enough to get access. It struck me as odd because usually if there's a new security measure, there's also some official justification, like classified documents in storage or some high-level meeting space. But this was unusual. We had to basically avoid entire corridors, and no reason was given. The official wording was something like, "Due to ongoing facility evaluations and structural concerns, employees are prohibited from entering the restricted areas without explicit authorization." The phrase facility evaluations is a catch-all that can mean anything from asbestos checks to top-secret expansions. Still, you mostly hear about it in dull contexts, not in ways that require hush-hush instructions and weird new badge scans. Around late January, I had to stay late one night. Budget deadlines don't care about your personal schedule, and since the start of the new year, everything was behind. It was around 7:30 p.m. and the building was quiet, with maybe just a few folks finishing up. At one point, I realized I needed to get some files from a coworker's desk. This coworker, let's call her Elena, was out sick, so I had to rummage through her desk drawers to find what I needed for the morning's presentation. Her desk is located on one of the lower floors, still above ground, but definitely away from the more populated offices near the entrance. As I was gathering the papers, I heard that scraping sound Gil had mentioned. It was faint at first, like something dragging along metal surfaces. Then it stopped. My first thought was, that's probably the janitorial staff. But the more I listened, the more it sounded like it was coming from behind the walls themselves, or maybe from a corridor on the other side of the wall. Government buildings can have thick walls, old piping, all sorts of echoes, so I tried to ignore it, but I couldn't help thinking about Gil's words. I decided to follow the sound because curiosity has always been both a curse and a blessing for me. So I stepped out into the hallway, scanning around for a maintenance cart or a staffer. Nothing. I heard the scraping again farther away this time, leading towards one of those sealed-off corridors that had been newly restricted. When I say sealed off, I mean the door wasn't physically barred shut, but you needed a special clearance badge to get through. Normally, I wouldn't even bother, but something compelled me to see if maybe there was a legitimate reason for those strange noises. I walked closer to the door and I heard a distinct click or scuttle. That's the best way I can describe it. It wasn't footsteps. It was sharper, like claws tapping or something with a hooking motion on the floor. My mind went to all the horror stories I'd read growing up. the ones about creatures lurking in old tunnels. I told myself to just keep moving along. I ended up heading back to my office, deciding that I'd had enough for the night. The next morning, I tried to casually mention the sounds to Gil again, who just nodded grimly and said something like, "I told you, but be careful who you tell this to." That last part made me realize he'd tried to bring it up to someone else before, and maybe he got shut down. Sure enough, a few days later, Gil was suddenly reassigned. He didn't lose his job, because that would be too obvious, I guess, but he was moved to a different building across town. He left quietly, and I didn't get a chance to speak to him again. That was the first major sign that something official was going on. People don't just get abruptly relocated in a government office unless they either messed up big time or stumbled onto something they shouldn't have. Not long after Gil's transfer, the building replaced a bunch of the security staff with new faces. Contractors, not direct government employees. These were stern-looking people, often wearing sunglasses indoors, which is weird in itself, and absolutely refusing to engage in small talk. That's when I got the sinking feeling that something was being swept under the rug, and that everyday employees like me were never supposed to know about it. We started getting more and more restrictions. Another wave of those vague memos came out, warning employees not to wander into designated maintenance zones. There was a rumor that a couple of interns had accidentally tried to go into the sub-basement looking for archived documents and were escorted out by men in suits who said absolutely nothing the entire time. That rumor came from a friend of a friend, so take it with a grain of salt, but it fit the pattern of everything else we'd been seeing. Around mid-February, a coworker, I'll call him Roger, started confiding in me that he'd been having strange dreams after working late. He said that on nights he stayed past 7 p.m. He'd sometimes nod off at his desk. He's one of those guys who gets up super early to beat traffic, so by 7 p.m. he's exhausted. He told me that in these half-dream states he'd see tall, spindly figures in the corridors, moving in a jerky but somehow fluid manner, almost like insects when they scuttle along a surface. But then he swore one time he jolted awake, looked out into the hallway, and briefly saw one of these shapes vanish behind a corner. It wasn't a shadow. He said it was something pale, almost grayish, with elongated limbs and a head that was more triangular than round. He only caught a glimpse of it, but it was enough to make him question his sanity. He told me all this in a hushed tone and kept saying, "Please don't think I'm crazy." Of course I didn't, because I'd already heard the sounds. The puzzle pieces started coming together, even though I desperately wanted to believe it was all just random building noises, illusions, or maybe just me losing it from stress. Things ramped up even more in March. One night, a friend who works in the office of the Chief Information Officer, OCIO, called me from his personal cell, sounding really agitated. He said some of the camera feeds on the sub-basement levels had been redirected to a separate server that was accessible only with top clearance. He stumbled on that by accident because part of his job was to do routine audits of the server load. In short, the cameras on some sub-level corridors had been rerouted so that only certain people, probably way above my pay grade, could see them. This friend told me, whatever they're hiding is big. They used an entirely different subnet that normal staff can't even ping. I asked if he'd seen any of the footage, and he said no, he tried, but he was immediately locked out. Next day, he got an email from his supervisor reminding him of his non-disclosure agreements. Needless to say, he didn't try to push it any further. Another month went by, and each time I stayed late, I felt a persistent sense of being watched. I started feeling paranoid, checking over my shoulder in the parking garage, making sure I locked my office door even though I had nothing truly valuable in there. I found out that a few other employees were having trouble sleeping, or they'd mention hearing weird noises, but the second you tried to talk about it in an open area, someone from security would always seem to be lurking, or a coworker would interrupt with a forced laugh. like they were trying to shut down the conversation. It was a heavy atmosphere. One night, this must have been the second week of April, I was there later than usual, working on an urgent budget matter. The building was mostly empty except for me, a handful of other staff, and presumably the security detail. Somewhere around 8 p.m., the overhead lights in my section flickered briefly, then stabilized. I got up to check the corridor because our floor usually doesn't have random power fluctuations. We have a facility maintenance team that keeps these systems running well. When I looked into the hallway, I noticed that the far end, the area leading toward the restricted sub-basement stairwell, was dark. Not just dim, but pitch black, like the emergency lights hadn't kicked on. Normally the hallway lights stay on at all hours. Curious, and yes, maybe a little dumb, I walked toward that end. As I approached, I heard what I can only describe as a clicking sound, kind of like a large insect's mandibles might make, or some mechanical device in need of oil. I froze. That's when, for the first time, I actually saw a shape. It was tall, maybe 7 feet or so, hard to judge because it was hunched over. I only caught a silhouette against the faint glow of an exit sign behind it, but I could see enough to know it wasn't human. The arms were too long, almost reaching where the knees would be if a person were standing there. The head was elongated, not quite mantis-like, but definitely not normal. It moved in a jerk-stop-jerk fashion, not fluid like a human stride, more like something that was adjusting every step with small, deliberate motions. If it had eyes, I didn't see them reflect in the darkness. I stood there, locked in place, while it shuffled for a few seconds along the corridor. Then, as if sensing me, it turned its entire body in my direction. I swear I felt an actual wave of dread wash over me. My rational brain screamed, "This can't be real," but my instincts told me to run. So I did. I practically sprinted back to my office, grabbed my keys and my bag, and left the building in record time, not even bothering to shut off my computer. That was a pivotal moment. I considered calling the police, but what would I say? There's a tall, insect-like thing creeping around the Department of Energy building after hours. Instead, I tried to confide in a friend who works across the street at the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum. He's a security officer over there. I figured maybe he'd heard about weird stuff in the tunnels that supposedly connect some of these buildings. He gave me a strange look and said, "You know, there are rumors about underground expansions that link a lot of government buildings, right? Some say they run all the way to the Capitol, or even further." But he didn't have any concrete evidence. It was just urban legend, or so he thought. He did mention that occasionally some of their overnight staff report hearing odd noises from the lower levels, but they usually assume it's the HVAC system. He also told me that the museum's security cameras sometimes glitch around 3 a.m., especially in the sub-basement storage areas where they keep old exhibits. He's convinced it's just a bug in the system, but now I wonder if it's something else entirely. The day after I saw that silhouette, I tried to talk discreetly to 2 other co-workers who do late shifts sometimes. One of them, Paula, basically shut down the conversation and told me, "I'm not risking my pension over ghost stories." That's what she said verbatim. The other co-worker just shook his head and warned me, "You bring this up too loudly, and you'll find yourself transferred to some backwater facility in no time." That night, I went home and did some serious thinking. I started searching online for similar accounts. At first, I thought those stories were pure sensationalism, the kind of thing you read for entertainment. But the more I read, the more I found parallels with the fleeting glimpses I'd had and the stories I'd heard from Gil, Roger, and others. I'm not saying everything on those sites is true, but some details matched too closely to be a coincidence. By May, the tension in the building had ratcheted up. We started seeing official visitors in black suits, not the usual government suits, but more nondescript, black tie, no lapel pin types. They'd walk in pairs or small groups, rarely spoke to us, and had this air of authority that made everyone uncomfortable. One day I spotted a pair of them coming out of the restricted stairwell area with what looked like specialized equipment cases. They hurried along, and one of them gave me a sharp glance that seemed to say, "Mind your own business." Around the same time, one of the cleaning staff, an older gentleman named Jorge, quietly mentioned to me that he'd been ordered never to clean the sub-basement floors, even though it was part of his job description when he first started. He told me, "They said it's not safe due to structural issues, but I've been working around old buildings my whole life, and that's bull. Something else is going on." Then he clammed up and wouldn't say another word. In early June, an incident occurred that really sent my alarm bells ringing. A coworker I was friendly with, Shelley, failed to show up for a morning briefing. This was unlike her. She's always punctual, often the first in the office. We tried calling her, with no response. The next day, we heard from HR that she was on indefinite leave, effective immediately. No one would say why, and we couldn't reach her at home. Finally, weeks later, I managed to get in touch with her sister, who told me that Shelley was in some kind of mental health facility. Apparently, Shelley had come home late one evening, babbling about nightmares and creatures in the building. She was found the next morning in a near catatonic state. This hit me hard because Shelley was as stable as they come, always level-headed, never prone to flights of fancy. It was like something had broken her mind. At this point, I was desperate for answers. I confided in a friend who's retired military intelligence. He told me that he'd heard rumors over the years of certain agencies, not necessarily the Department of Energy, but hush-hush subdivisions, dealing with things beyond normal comprehension. He mentioned something about joint research initiatives that might involve studying non-human entities or interdimensional phenomena, always kept under wraps due to national security concerns. I asked him point blank if he thought the building might be hosting some kind of covert operation. He wouldn't confirm or deny it. He just said, "Watch your back and keep your mouth shut until you're sure who you can trust." Over the summer, the building underwent more renovations, which of course meant more areas got sealed off or plastered with restricted access signs. Some of my colleagues started joking nervously that maybe we were storing aliens in the basement, but there was a real undercurrent of fear in those jokes because no one truly believed it was a laughing matter anymore. The official lines we were given never quite added up. Some said we were upgrading the piping or the electrical grid, but the construction noises we heard, if they were that, happened mostly at night, and they didn't sound like normal jackhammers or drilling. They were more like odd hums, pulses, and sometimes a distant banging that seemed to come from beneath even the sub-basement. That begs the question, how many layers are under this building that we're not told about? Sometime in July, I had another run-in with something I can't explain. I was working late again, seems to be a pattern for me, and decided to head to the vending machines for a snack. The corridor leading to the machines was dimly lit, the overhead lights flickering in a way I'd never seen them do during daytime. I noticed movement at the end of the hallway, near the door that leads to a locked stairwell, a different one from before but still restricted access. The door was ajar, which is extremely odd because those doors are usually locked tight and require a code. As I approached, I heard a heavy breathing or panting sound, like an animal. It was labored, and it almost had a wet quality to it, like each breath was accompanied by a slight gurgle. My heart pounded, but I inched forward just enough to see around the edge of the door. In that split second, I saw what I can only describe as a shape that was partially hidden behind the door's frame. It was pale, but not exactly white, more an off-gray color, and it had a torso that looked too narrow to belong to a person. The arms or legs, I couldn't tell which, were bent at angles that didn't look anatomically correct for a human. Whatever it was, it turned its head in my direction. I didn't see eyes in the normal sense, but I felt its gaze. I stumbled backward, and by the time I managed to stand up straight, the door slammed shut. I heard the mechanical lock engage. For a moment, I thought I was going to pass out from the adrenaline surge. After that incident, I seriously considered quitting. But you know how it is with government jobs, the benefits, the pension, the stability. Plus, I was worried if I left abruptly, it might draw more attention to me than staying. So I stayed. But every day I felt trapped by the knowledge that something was very wrong in that building. I started documenting everything in a personal journal at home, away from prying eyes. Times, dates, who said what, and anything odd I encountered. I was building a case for myself in case anything happened to me. I didn't trust my office computer anymore. By mid-August, I began noticing a pattern. These creatures, or whatever they are, seemed most active in the late evening to early morning hours. I gleaned this from overhearing random comments and from my own encounters. Some employees reported seeing shadowy movements or hearing strange noises around 2 to 4 a.m. if they had to pull an all-nighter. The official line from building management was that the cleaning crews were working in unconventional hours to avoid disturbing daytime operations. But that never squared with the sightings of spindly shapes or inhuman silhouettes. It wasn't just me anymore. A handful of others were quietly sharing their own stories, but we all agreed we couldn't bring it up openly. Some of them believed it was some weird subterranean cryptid. Others believed it might be some sort of government experiment gone wrong that they were trying to contain. A few whispered about interdimensional entities, as crazy as that sounds. But given the bizarre movement and the fact that conventional logic didn't apply, maybe they're not so crazy after all. I started looking into the building's history. The Forrestal building was constructed in the late 1960s and early 1970s. It's named after James Forrestal, the first Secretary of Defense. Some conspiracies revolve around Forrestal's own tragic death and alleged knowledge of alien matters. There are those old rumors about Majestic 12, Roswell, etc. I'm no conspiracy buff, but I found it interesting that some of these rumors tie into the Department of Energy because DOE has labs all over the country, many involved in nuclear research, and historically, anything to do with nuclear technology often intersects with alleged UFO or extraterrestrial phenomena. I also discovered that the building site is near L'Enfant Plaza, an area that has a lot of underground infrastructure, metro lines, pedestrian tunnels, and who knows what else. It's not a stretch to suspect there are deeper, classified floors beneath the official sub-basement levels. By September, the sightings became almost routine among the few of us who kept tabs on each other. We'd warn each other if we had to stay late and share any new tidbits of information. One coworker claimed to have overheard a hushed conversation near the loading dock between two of those men in black suits and a uniformed military officer. She didn't catch everything, but she swears they were talking about containment measures and biological risk. Another staffer told me he saw a set of large crates being unloaded in the middle of the night, with no shipping labels except a red stripe around the edges. He wanted to ask someone about it, but a stern security officer just waved him away. These crates supposedly went straight to one of those restricted freight elevators that goes to the sub-basement. It's reminiscent of something out of a sci-fi thriller, but this is real life. October rolled around and the atmosphere turned even darker. The days were getting shorter, so nighttime came faster, and so did the sense of dread. One incident that really shook me was when I was leaving the building around 9 p.m. I got into the elevator on the 3rd floor intending to go down to the lobby. I was alone. The elevator descended normally at first, then suddenly lurched. The lights flickered, and instead of stopping at the lobby, it passed it and went down to the basement level. The doors opened, but it was completely dark beyond them. No lights at all. and I heard that same wet breathing noise I'd heard before. I slammed the door close button, and it took an agonizing few seconds for the doors to shut and the elevator to move again. By the time I got back to the lobby, I was shaking so badly I could barely walk. The security guard at the front desk asked if I was okay. I just nodded and hurried out to my car. By November, I noticed more staff were resigning than usual, especially those who worked later hours. The official line was always personal reasons, early retirement, or better opportunities elsewhere. But I suspected they were just frightened. I tried to talk to HR about staff turnover, but they gave me a canned response about normal fluctuations and no cause for concern. I even considered transferring departments or requesting to shift to a purely telework schedule, but my job function still required some on-site presence, especially given budget sign-offs that needed in-person verification. It felt like a trap, to be honest. That's when the second wave of outside personnel arrived. Not just the men in black suits this time, but also certain high-level officials from the Department of Defense, or so their badges claimed. They came in small groups and always seemed to be headed to the secure elevator banks that led to the restricted areas. They carried black briefcases and never engaged in casual conversation. I tried to see if I recognized any rank insignias, but the few glimpses I caught were unusual, like they wore no standard insignia I'd ever seen. A coworker with a military background told me quietly that some of their patches looked custom. Officially, no one acknowledged these visits. That's typical for hush-hush government operations, but combined with everything else, it cemented my belief that we were dealing with some black budget project or a top-secret containment effort for these creatures. December rolled in, and with it came holiday schedules. Fewer people in the building meant more quiet nights, and presumably more freedom for whatever was lurking in the restricted zones. Around this time, a staffer I barely knew pulled me aside in the hallway. She looked pale and on edge, and she said, "You have to stop asking questions. They know you've been talking to people." I asked her who they were, but she just shook her head. Before I could say more, she hurried away. That did it for me. I was officially scared for my personal safety. I realized that I needed to document this thoroughly and maybe blow the whistle if it came to that. But I'm no hero. I know how the system can chew you up and spit you out. My plan was to collect enough evidence, a few photos, maybe a snippet of a weird official memo, and then find a way to release it anonymously. But that's easier said than done. Every time I tried to do anything that might gather physical proof, I felt eyes on me. Security cameras are everywhere, and the new guard seemed particularly interested in monitoring staff after hours. Then came the final straw just a few weeks ago. I was working late again. Yes, I know, I should have learned by now. I decided I needed to use the restroom before heading home. On my way back, I saw a flicker of movement to my right. I turned and saw one of the restricted access doors slightly open. I have no idea why it was open, but I could hear noises inside, like a low hissing or growling. My body reacted before my mind did. I crept closer to see if maybe a guard was in trouble or something. The corridor beyond that door was dimly lit by emergency lights, so it was a hazy yellow glow. And there on the floor, I saw something crouched. It was roughly the size of a person, but the posture was all wrong. Its limbs bent in a way that made me want to vomit just looking at it. I'm not sure if it was feeding on something or just crouching, but I saw what looked like a flash of a narrow face, elongated jaw, and a segmented torso. I gasped, and it snapped its head up. There was a second, just a fraction of a second, where we locked eyes, or whatever it uses to see. I can't even fully describe its face, but it was enough to send every fight or flight response in my body into overdrive. I stumbled backward, slammed the door shut, and ran. I didn't bother collecting my things this time. I went straight for the exit. As I left, I saw 2 new security guards rushing past me with a certain urgency, but no surprise on their faces, like they knew exactly what they were dealing with. That same night, at home, I received a phone call from a blocked number. When I answered, an electronically distorted voice simply said, "Stay out of this." Then the line disconnected. That was it. That's when I decided I can't just let this go on without at least letting someone know. I started writing everything down in detail, much of which I've condensed here, though I guess this is still pretty long-winded. I'm sure my phone is bugged, and my work email is definitely monitored. So I'm sending you this from a secure, encrypted address I set up with a friend who works in cybersecurity. Hopefully, it buys me enough anonymity. I'm not entirely sure what's going on in the Forestal building. I don't know if these creatures are some undisclosed cryptid, extraterrestrial, or interdimensional entities, or a top-secret genetic experiment that got out of hand. All I know is that they're real, they're being hidden, and people who question it face serious consequences. My best guess is that some faction within the government, maybe working with or under the Department of Defense or some other clandestine group, has been conducting research or containment operations in the sublevels. The Department of Energy has historically been involved in advanced research, and perhaps these creatures, or whatever they are part of an experiment or phenomenon that's too sensitive to disclose. I might be missing a lot of pieces of this puzzle. Part of me wishes I could forget it all and move on with my life. But seeing how many people have been affected, Gil, Shelley, Roger, and the rest, and how many unanswered questions remain, I feel a responsibility to share my experience. If something happens to me, I want there to be a record that all of this was real. I can't guarantee that everything I've interpreted is 100% correct, but the sightings, the forced transfers, the hush-hush security, and the actual glimpses I've had of those inhuman shapes, those are facts I can't ignore. I'm hoping that by reaching out to you, you might know others who've experienced similar things in other government buildings, or maybe even know investigators or journalists who can shed more light on this. I'm sending this email late at night from a place where I hope I won't be tracked. I don't know what tomorrow will bring. Maybe I'll show up to work and find out my badge has been deactivated, or maybe I'll get reassigned like Gil. But at least now my story is out there, and if you choose to share it, with my identity protected, I hope it resonates with others who might have seen the same. I'm terrified, to be honest, that I'll wake up in the middle of the night to find someone at my door, telling me to keep quiet. But I can't live with myself if I don't speak up. People need to know that the government, or at least some part of it, is hiding things about these creatures. Thank you for taking the time to read this. I know it's long-winded, disorganized, and maybe a bit frantic, but it's as honest and raw as I can make it. If you have any advice, or if you know a safe way to get this information further out there, please let me know. I appreciate your discretion more than I can express, and thank you for your help. I still remember the first night it happened. Back then, I was a corporal stationed at Fort Bliss, out in the desert near El Paso, Texas. Many think being in the Army means constant action, but on a large post like Bliss, most days are routine. Checking IDs at the gate, running scheduled patrols, maintaining vehicles. You get used to that rhythm until something breaks it in a way you don't expect. One night, I was on the midnight to dawn shift along the perimeter fence on the southeastern side of the installation. The air was cool, and the desert had that stillness it gets once the daytime heat drains away. My partner, Specialist Howard, had stepped away for a quick break behind a Humvee. Meanwhile, I was just pacing the fence, scanning the open ground beyond. We were near a part of Fort Bliss where the wire fence stretches out for miles, with little more than scrub brush on the other side. I'd just taken a sip from my thermos of coffee when a strange feeling swept over me, the sense that someone was watching. A desert at night can play tricks on you. Random shapes, the rustling of the wind, but the sensation wouldn't go away. I raised my flashlight, slowly moving it along the fence line. That's when I saw it, a figure standing just on the other side of the fence, barely 20 yards away. My first instinct was that it had to be a civilian who wandered too close to the base. I shouted the usual challenge, "Identify yourself," and aimed the beam right at them. But something was off. The figure wasn't fully solid, or maybe the desert dust was messing with my vision. It appeared hazy around the edges, like heat shimmer. My heart thumped. I called out again, "Restricted area, show me your hands." No reply, no movement, just that dark outline. I remember a chill creeping up my back. An intruder usually reacts, either running or shouting back. This figure stayed unnervingly still. Then, in the time it took me to blink, it faded into thin air, dissolving in front of my eyes. I lowered my flashlight, stunned, and started to second-guess what had just happened. Any normal trespasser would leave footprints or run into the desert. This looked more like a glitch in reality. I radioed it in. "Base, this is Corporal Reyes. Possible intruder near the perimeter." Checking, the operator acknowledged, told me to hold tight. Howard came jogging back, alarmed by my tone, and I explained what I'd seen. We searched the fence line for 100 yards in both directions, but nothing suggested anyone had been there. The dirt was undisturbed except for my own boot prints. Before long, 2 more soldiers rolled up in a Humvee, Sergeant Valdez and Specialist Ortiz. Their spotlights revealed nothing. They told me maybe I was tired or had mistaken a shadow. Still, I completed a routine incident report. No one seemed especially worried once they saw there was no fence damage, no real sign of trespassing. I went off duty at dawn, but I couldn't shake how strange it felt. No intruder could vanish like that. The next few nights were quiet. I stayed alert but saw nothing unusual, and I began to think maybe it hadn't really happened. Then about a week later, I heard 2 soldiers whispering in the mess hall about a shadow figure near the wire on the east side. When they noticed me listening, they clammed up. I pressed them, but they changed the subject. My gut told me they'd seen something like I had, but didn't want to talk about it. A few days later, I searched the official logs for any mention of strange sightings. I found nothing beyond my own entry. I asked around, but most people gave me the same brush-off. However, one old-timer hinted that weird sightings weren't new at Fort Bliss. He mentioned older rumors of a blurry shape that sometimes showed up along the fence. People called it a ghost or a leftover from the days when the base handled classified projects. Typical rumor mill chatter, but I noticed an undercurrent of tension whenever it came up. Time passed. I tried to put it out of my head. Then one afternoon, I was approached by a lieutenant I barely knew who said, "I heard you saw something strange on patrol. Word of advice, let it go." He didn't elaborate. He simply walked off, leaving me with a sinking feeling that something about my sighting had rankled people higher up. The next morning, I found a typed note slipped under my door in the barracks. It read, "If you want answers, check archived security logs from the mid-90s. Records office, 3rd floor. No name, no signature." My pulse pounded. This was either a prank or a lead. Fort Bliss keeps older documents in a dusty records building on the main administrative side. After making up an excuse about needing old duty rosters, I slipped in there one afternoon. Rows of file cabinets, boxes stacked high, the usual bureaucratic clutter. Eventually, I found a set labeled Security, Archive, 1995 to 1999. Rifling through, I spotted a handful of reports describing unknown silhouettes near the fence at night, always vanishing before a guard could make contact. The pattern matched exactly what I'd experienced. The final note on each: unresolved, closed, no action. Toward the back of the box, I discovered a few sealed folders stamped confidential. One had references to Project Anomaly, potential psychological factor. Another recommended minimal dissemination, monitor for recurrence. The signature at the bottom was unreadable, but it carried a high rank. Footsteps sounded in the hallway, so I hurriedly put everything back, heart racing. I left that building certain I wasn't the first to see this figure, and the base had known about it for years, quietly burying the reports. That night, I tried to talk to my partner Howard about it. He just shook his head, told me not to stir up trouble. "This place has secrets, man," he said. "If you dig too deep, you might regret it." I got the message. Someone was actively discouraging soldiers from investigating. A part of me wanted to push harder, but I also valued my career. So I kept quiet, aside from scribbling my own notes in a personal journal. Weeks went by. Routine. Then something changed in early spring. The base prepared to host a special operations exercise, though details were vague. More black SUVs appeared, some with tinted windows and license plates that didn't seem local. Men in suits, not standard military uniforms, started moving around HQ. It gave me a bad feeling. At first I thought it was just high-level training or top brass visiting, but it felt different. Late one night, I was assigned to the motor pool for an inventory shift. Nearly everyone else had gone home, leaving me with rows of parked vehicles. Around midnight, I stepped out for fresh air and saw a black SUV cruise slowly by, as if patrolling. The windows were so dark I couldn't see inside. It glided around a corner and I was left with that same uneasy awareness, like being watched. Feeling restless, I decided to check the fence area behind the motor pool. The glare from the base floodlights wasn't as strong there, leaving big patches of shadow. Sure enough, I caught a glimpse of that same figure, the silhouette, the hazy outline. This time it was inside the perimeter fence, standing near some stacked crates. My stomach dropped. I flashed my light on it, calling out, "This is a secure area. Identify yourself." The shape moved, turning what I assumed was its head toward me. I felt a wave of dizziness, like the air around it shimmered. It took a few steps behind the crates, and by the time I reached that spot, it was gone. I radioed for backup immediately. Instead of the usual base patrol, 2 suits and 2 military police arrived. They ordered me to show them where I saw the figure. We searched, finding nothing. No footprints, no sign of forced entry. The suits bombarded me with questions, their tones cold. Did it speak? How long was it visible? Was it armed? Then they basically dismissed me, saying, "We'll handle this." They gave no names, wore no unit patches. It was nerve-wracking. I tried to file a detailed statement, but the base's incident report software mysteriously locked me out. When I asked my sergeant, he said the system was under maintenance. I knew that was code for someone doesn't want your report on record. Over the next week, unscheduled helicopter flights arrived at odd hours, landing in a remote corner of Fort Bliss. No official announcements were made. Soldiers whispered about secret ops or black projects. At the same time, a few people claimed to have glimpsed the shadow figure in different spots around the base, near an old supply depot, around some deserted warehouses. Each sighting ended with confusion and no physical evidence. All this fueled my suspicion that the suits weren't just visitors. They were part of some specialized unit, maybe there to handle this phenomenon. Once, I saw men in black tactical gear with no identifiable markings setting up equipment near an abandoned range. They left as soon as I approached, giving me dark glares that said, "Leave this alone." Then I got another note slipped under my door. "Midnight, Hangar 10, come alone." I hesitated, but my curiosity won out. Late that night, I snuck across the flight line to Hangar 10, which was mostly used for storage. The doors were locked, but a side entrance was propped open. Inside, the place was dimly lit by a single overhead lamp. A man in a dark uniform with no rank insignia stepped out from behind a pile of crates, put a finger to his lips. He said he knew I'd been looking into the sightings, claimed he was with a classified division tasked to track anomalies. He wouldn't give specifics. Instead, he insisted the figure might be a side effect of older research, maybe electromagnetic tests from decades ago. Something went wrong, and now it occasionally manifested around Fort Bliss. That's all he said before warning me to keep quiet if I didn't want serious trouble. He handed me an envelope of documents, then slipped out a back exit. I stood there, stunned, my heart hammering. Back in my barracks, I opened the envelope. It contained a few blurred photos, a person wearing something that looked like advanced camouflage gear, half invisible, plus a heavily redacted memo referencing phase shift technology. Another line said, "Original meltdown, 1984. Subject not recovered." Could that mean someone used an experimental suit, something short-circuited, and now it existed halfway in our reality? The idea sounded outlandish, but it fit the bizarre sightings. And apparently the army, or some branch of the government, wanted to keep it buried. I tried to sleep, but couldn't. After that, the base grew more tense. Helicopters arrived at random hours, and unusual men roamed the installation, scanning the perimeter with odd devices. Soldiers whispered about a lockdown that never got announced to the rank and file. I laid low, continuing my routine tasks, but my mind raced each night. I started a personal log of everything I'd discovered. Then, one night, an operation kicked off near the fence where I'd first seen the figure. I only knew because a friend in communications told me something big was happening out there. I grabbed a set of binoculars and found a vantage point near a storage shed. That's when I saw those men in black tactical gear again. They placed strange tripods at intervals along the wire, each with a pulsing light. After an hour of preparation, they spread out in a line, scanning the darkness with handheld monitors. Suddenly, those monitors beeped, and the men aimed floodlights at a single spot. For a few seconds, I saw it, the hazy silhouette, flickering under the intense beams. It seemed to writhe, like it was in pain or unstable. A deep crackling filled the air, and arcs of faint light danced around the figure. Then it dropped, as if collapsing, only to vanish entirely. The men rushed in, equipment at the ready, but there was nothing to capture. One soldier slammed his gear on the ground in frustration, cursing. They packed up and left, clearly not victorious. Whatever they'd tried to do, contain or destroy the figure, had failed. A few days passed, and the suits slowly disappeared. The black SUVs left. An official memo came down about resuming normal operations. No mention of the bizarre nighttime maneuvers. From a distance, Fort Bliss looked the same as ever, full of daily drills and standard duties. If you didn't know better, you'd never suspect anything unusual had happened. I tried verifying the entire incident in official logs. Nothing. Not a single entry about the night operation, the figure, or the equipment. It was like the base had collectively decided to forget. Soldiers who might have seen something kept quiet, or they told me to drop it. I realized I'd reached the limit of what I could investigate without risking my career. Still, I documented everything in private, storing my notes and those documents somewhere safe off post. Over time, I rose in rank, received new assignments, but the memory stuck with me. A few times I heard fresh rumors. Someone spotted a blurry shape near the old test range, or a staff sergeant claimed he saw footprints in the dust that led nowhere. Each time, the story died quickly. The hush was strong. Even if you tried to speak up, you'd be met with locked files, missing logs, or sudden reassignments. Sometimes I've thought of going public, but who would believe me? I'd sound like someone chasing ghost stories. And I know from the men in suits and the black gear teams that the pushback could be dangerous. They had resources and authority beyond typical army channels. If they wanted, they could brand me unstable or a security risk. Better to keep my head down. Yet it's hard. I still see the figure in my dreams, half lit by a flashlight dissolving into thin air. My mind replays that night operation where those men nearly cornered it, or the conversation with the unknown soldier in Hangar 10, telling me it was a leftover from a decades-old experiment. I wrestle with whether it's a ghost, a glitch, or an echo of advanced tech gone wrong. The Army has tested so many things over the years: chemical weapons, stealth prototypes, who knows what else. Fort Bliss is vast with plenty of hidden corners. It's not impossible to imagine something was unleashed and can't be reined in. I've been stationed at other places too, but I keep coming back to Bliss. Sometimes I stand at the fence line at dusk scanning the desert. I wonder if I'll spot that shape again. Part of me hopes I won't, and part of me hopes I do, just to confirm I'm not crazy. I can't deny what I saw, and I know there's a cluster of old files in some off-limits cabinet that would back me up, plus the documents in my stash. But the official stance is that none of this exists. It's the easiest path to protect their secrets. A couple of times I've heard about sightings on other bases. Could it be the same phenomenon traveling around? Or are there multiple anomalies connected to hidden research? The Army's done a lot of top-secret work over the decades. Maybe Fort Bliss is just one node in a bigger network. That thought keeps me up sometimes. If technology can break the boundary between normal reality and something else, maybe these incidents are happening more often than anyone suspects. On quiet nights, I sometimes recall the final words of that unknown soldier in Hangar 10. They'll let you be as long as you stop pushing. It sounded almost regretful, like he wanted to do more, but couldn't. Maybe there are others like him, people who've seen too much and tried to drop hints to those who come close to discovering the truth. Now, after years in the service, I've learned to live with the knowledge that Fort Bliss harbors a secret that remains unsolved, and possibly unsolvable. The figure is out there, slipping between appearances, ignoring fences and floodlights. The men in suits and black gear tried to capture or destroy it, and they failed. They left no formal record, but I watched them with my own eyes. To anyone stationed at Bliss, I'd say this: if you're on perimeter duty at night and see a tall, hazy shape, think twice before reporting it, because the moment you do, you might become a target of curiosity or intimidation by people far above your pay grade. The best you can do is keep your eyes open, quietly share notes with those you trust, and accept that not everything on a military installation is straightforward. For some soldiers, that's fine. They don't want to know. For me, it's become a burden I can't quite shake. Part of me wants to chase the truth. Another part knows it's too dangerous. Sometimes I catch a whisper in the PX or read something online about unexplained sightings near Bliss. I recognize the signs of a fresh encounter, but it never breaks into mainstream news. That hush is total and efficient. The Army denies it. The local press never picks it up, and soldiers learn not to ask questions. I'm not sure how long it'll stay secret. If the phenomenon is truly some byproduct of old experiments, maybe it'll fade over time or appear somewhere else entirely. Maybe it's stuck at Bliss, bound to the place that created it. Either way, I suspect the suits will always return whenever it shows up, determined to keep it hidden. I remain with the Army because, despite this, I believe in serving my country. But I'm no longer naive about what governments might bury under layers of classification. We're taught to follow orders, not to question. Yet once you've glimpsed something that defies logic, you can't fully go back. You do your job while holding on to secrets no one wants you to share. There have been moments, late at night, when I wonder if the figure is truly dangerous or more of a victim. Could it be the echo of a soldier trapped in a misfired test? Or is it something else entirely? An entity with its own agenda? No one I've spoken to can say for sure. All they can do is speculate or dismiss it. Meanwhile, I keep that second envelope of photos hidden somewhere safe, just in case I need to prove to myself or someone else that I'm not imagining all this. Over time, I've gotten better at compartmentalizing. I handle daily tasks, pass inspections, keep up with PT, but every so often I return to that fence line after dark, shining my flashlight across the desert. Most nights I see nothing but dust. Once in a while, though, the air seems to ripple, and I catch a brief flicker of movement. I freeze, waiting, but it's gone before I can be sure. Maybe it's just the wind stirring up sand, or maybe it's that figure watching from the other side, half here and half not, the living memory of a classified mistake. That's my story. I can't prove it in an official sense because the paperwork has been erased and the suits are gone, but I've got enough fragments to know I'm not alone in what I've seen. If you find yourself at Fort Bliss and hear quiet rumors about a silhouette that fades in the light, don't laugh it off. Some jokes hide real fear. Some legends aren't just legends. Someday I might leave the service and distance myself from this, but part of me knows I'll never forget. Once you see behind the curtain, see the lengths people will go to keep a secret, the world looks different. And if you ever catch sight of that hazy outline drifting along a fence line at midnight, you'll understand how it can make your blood run cold, knowing you've stepped onto ground you were never meant to walk. When I lie awake, I sometimes imagine the future. Maybe new technology will succeed where those men in black gear failed, and the figure will be contained or neutralized. Or maybe it'll slip away into the desert, drifting far beyond Fort Bliss. The army moves on, missions change, and time buries old secrets. But I doubt it's truly gone, because you can't just bury something that big and pretend it never happened, no matter how thick the layers of top secret stamps are. That's the reality behind the chain link fences, the checkpoint gates, and the uniform drills. The army might give the impression of order and clarity, but scattered in its history are pockets of chaos, things that slip through the cracks of normal regulations. Whether it's a glitch in advanced camouflage or some fragment of another dimension, I can't say. All I know is that soldiers like me have seen it, and the men with no insignias have tried to erase every trace. They can erase the official documents, but they can't erase our memories. And as long as we remember, the secret isn't fully safe. So if by some crazy coincidence you're assigned perimeter duty at Fort Bliss someday, keep your flashlight handy and don't lose sight of your partner. If you happen to glimpse a tall, featureless silhouette near the wire, think carefully about who you tell, because the men who arrive next might be more interested in silencing you than explaining what you saw. That's the strange, unsettling truth hidden beneath the desert sun here in Texas, and it's not going anywhere anytime soon. I've been working as a farmland real estate agent around the central Nebraska area for a little over 15 years, give or take a few months. It started as a side gig when my father retired from the family farm near Ord, and I found I had a knack for connecting folks with land, especially places alongside rivers or creeks. There's just something about that riparian zone, rich soil, sturdy bank lines, and a pleasant view that you can't quite put a price on sometimes. Anyway, I was out near the Middle Lou River, checking on a parcel scheduled for a showing, and that's when I found something downright peculiar. I've dealt with unusual situations before, like once, a truck got stuck in the fields during a meet and greet, but I've never encountered anything of this magnitude. I was about a mile south of Dannebrog on 11C Road, right by the segment of farmland bordering this narrow creek that feeds into the loop. I had parked my pickup along the gravel shoulder because I wanted to walk the perimeter, maybe snap a few photos of the water flow. If a buyer asks about irrigation potential, I like to give them a real sense of the land's capacity. It was around 4:30 in the evening. The sun was still high enough to see well, but it was starting that gentle downward tilt which makes everything cast a longer shadow. I remember being slightly annoyed because I'd forgotten my water bottle back in the truck, and by the time I realized I was parched, I'd already traipsed a good quarter-mile from the main road. I was heading toward the creek when I noticed these huge impressions in the mud. Now, I'm no stranger to footprints near creeks. Deer, raccoon, the occasional coyote, and even your normal human footprints from pesky hunters who ignore posted signs. But these looked off. Each print was definitely shaped somewhat like a bare foot, but at least twice as big as any foot I've come across in my time outdoors. I'm talking maybe 18 inches long and quite broad, and the weirdest part was the stride length. The distance between each print was massive, easily 4 feet from toe to heel in a consistent line, which means whatever made them had a long gait. I tried to measure them using the only thing I had handy, a battered measuring tape I keep in my bag for property lines. I'm no expert at quick calculations, but my guess puts them around 17 or 18 inches in length and about 7 inches wide at their widest point. Now, typically, I'd brush off weird tracks as maybe a trick of the mud or just an odd shape left by something sliding. But there were at least 4 consecutive impressions, all equally spaced out, and leading from the creek bank about 15 feet inland before disappearing into the thicker brush. I stood there for maybe 10 minutes, going back and forth, tilting my head, checking the angle of the sun, and trying not to sink into the mud myself. I even went on a tangent, thinking about how maybe someone was playing a prank. I've heard stories of teenagers making fake Bigfoot footprints for kicks, but out there so far off the main road, it just seemed unlikely. There are only a few folks living in that stretch, and they're older folks who aren't exactly the prankster type. I recall reading an article years ago about alleged Bigfoot sightings near the Platte River Basin, and it crossed my mind in that moment. The footprints had that hallmark shape. Think of a human foot, only far thicker in the heel. The toes were even visible in the mud, splayed out like you'd expect from a barefoot walker. But seeing something like this up close really gave me the heebie-jeebies. My mind started wandering to all the stories of unexplained sightings in the region, especially the ones around the Niobrara River up by Valentine. But this find was right here near Dannebrog, which isn't exactly on anyone's top list of tourist spots. It's mostly farmland and wide open spaces. I stayed out there longer than I'd planned. I walked around looking for any other evidence, broken branches, hair, scat, anything that might give me a clue as to what made those prints. The brush was thick, so I couldn't push in very far without risking a twisted ankle or stepping into a hidden hole. I did notice that some of the taller grasses had been disturbed, as though something large had pushed through, but that's about all I found. After a bit, I realized the sun was starting to set behind the tree line, and I got this unsettling feeling, like I might not really want to be there after dark. I headed back to the truck, thinking I'd lock the pictures I took in a safe place on my phone. Funny enough, as I was climbing in, I remembered an old client telling me a story about strange calls in the night, like whoops or howls, far beyond the typical coyote yips. It was just one of those things that I used to dismiss as tall tales from someone who'd grown up with local folklore. But seeing those massive footprints made me reconsider all those stories. It's one thing to read about outlandish sightings online. It's another thing to come face to face, or rather foot to foot, with something you can't quite explain. I drove home with my mind racing. At one point, I almost passed my own driveway. I was so preoccupied thinking about those footprints. My partner thought I looked pale as a ghost when I walked in the door. I ended up sitting at our kitchen table, flipping through the day's photos on my phone, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. A couple of neighbors and I had a conversation the next morning about local wildlife. Indirectly, I brought up weird footprints to gauge if anyone else had seen something bigger than a man lurking around that farmland. They mostly shrugged it off, saying maybe it was a stray moose. But I've seen moose tracks when I lived up in Minnesota for a time. This was no moose. If I hadn't seen the size and clarity of these tracks for myself, I might have just chalked it up to an overactive imagination. but they were so distinct, and the area around them was too remote for a casual hoax. Animals can leave strange prints, sure, but these had toe outlines, a heel, and that crazy large stride. Nobody's going around barefoot out there in mid-August with all the burrs and thorny weeds. Plus, to get that size, we're talking a foot nearly half my entire lower leg in length. I know your YouTube channel covers a wide breadth of stories from people like me who stumble across the bizarre in their everyday routines. I guess I'm writing to you because I need a place to send these thoughts, somewhere they won't be immediately dismissed or ridiculed. I'm not saying I saw some towering creature lumbering across the field, but I absolutely found footprints that left me rattled. The rest of the day, all I could do was replay the scenario in my head, the shape of the prints, the depth of the mud, the hush of the trees around that creek. And I'm usually a level-headed person. I've spent years dealing with tough negotiations and random setbacks on the job. Nothing quite threw me off like this did. Ever since mid-March, the snow has finally started melting off here in eastern South Dakota, revealing all sorts of mess along the back roads. I'm around the outskirts of Burbank, not far from Vermilion, and there's this little county road that cuts through the farmland toward the bluffs by the Missouri River. The last storm we had, the one right after that cold snap in early March, the ditches were piled high with drifts, and I recall thinking we'd be in for a lot of cleanup once everything thawed out. Well, it was actually last week, around 11 p.m., when I was taking my usual evening run around the property to check fences. There are coyotes that like to test the perimeter, and it was surprisingly clear despite the leftover slush. The night was calm, with that faint edge of spring in the air, and I was shining my flashlight along the fence posts looking for any breaks when I noticed something up ahead near the edge of the gravel road. At first, I assumed it was just a big dog or maybe a coyote. We get them rummaging in the ditches, especially after folks hit a deer and leave it. But the shape was different, almost too tall even from a distance, like when you see a deer stand on its hind legs for a split second, though it obviously wasn't a deer. The strangest thing was it was sort of perched over something, hunched down, and it looked like it had these elongated arms supporting its weight. I moved a little closer, but I was trying to keep quiet because if it was a coyote, I didn't want it bolting at me or spooking the livestock. As I got within maybe 50 yards, I realized it was feeding on some kind of roadkill, maybe a possum or raccoon. Hard to say since it was pretty mangled. The way it was bent over, I could see the pronounced angles of its shoulders and back, and its skin had this pale, almost grayish tone, like it had never seen a day of sunlight. The flashlight from 50 yards away wasn't strong enough to get a perfect look, so I inched closer still, probably being dumber than I should have been. I remember thinking about an old story my neighbor told me years ago about something he swore he saw skulking up in the trees by the bluffs. He called it a pale freak, or something like that, and claimed it wasn't a person or animal. At the time, I chalked it up to local folklore or an overactive imagination. Seeing this thing made those old words ring in my ears, and I felt every hair on my neck stand up. The closer I got, the more I could tell it was definitely not any normal animal. It was big, taller than me if it stood up. I'm guessing well over 6 feet. Its limbs were elongated, and although it was crouched, you could see the structure was all wrong for a human. There was hardly any shape to indicate muscle or fat, more like wiry and bony. The noise it made, or rather the wet ripping sounds, is what nearly made me turn on my heels right then. The crunching and squelching of it pulling apart the carcass was nauseating, but curiosity kept me from running off immediately. I had a weird sensation like I was seeing something nobody's meant to see. My cows were a good quarter-mile behind me in the other direction, so I wasn't too worried about them right at that moment. But a thought flashed through my mind. If it was this comfortable feeding out in the open ditch, what's to stop it from venturing closer to the barn if it got curious? I noticed the roadkill was likely a deer because I spotted a hoof sticking out. That's when it dawned on me that this must have been the doe a neighbor had mentioned hitting a day or two prior. It's fairly common for us to leave a deer if it's too battered up, but usually other scavengers get to it. Coyotes, vultures, or occasionally some big dog from who knows where. This, though, I've never seen anything like it in all my years here. The arms had these long fingers that seemed to grip and tear at the flesh, which is a detail that still gives me the shakes. No fur, no clothing, just this smooth, pale hide. In the moonlight, it almost reflected a bit, kind of like those hairless cats, but much bigger and infinitely more unsettling. I'm not sure if it ever actually looked right at me, because its face was mostly obscured by the darkness and by how it was angled. But there was a moment when it paused, like it froze mid-bite, and I thought I saw a flash of a gaunt, hollow-eyed face with a mouth stained dark from the blood. Hard to be certain, but that's the image that stuck in my head after I finally forced myself to back away. I realized I was just standing there like a fool, shining my dim flashlight in its general direction. I didn't want to spook it into chasing me, so I tried a slow retreat, controlling my breathing, heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my temples. I circled back behind some hay bales near the field entrance, crouching down. It never made a loud noise, no scream or anything, just that wet chewing. Eventually, I couldn't bear to watch any longer. It must have been after midnight by the time I worked up the nerve to head back to the house. My first thought was to tell my wife, but she was asleep, and the last thing I wanted was to scare her with this insane story in the middle of the night. I did end up telling her the next morning, and she just looked at me, half thinking I might have dreamed it up, but I was stone cold sober, and I know what I saw. She suggested we check for tracks, but by the time we got out there in the daylight, what little snow was left had melted into the soft ground, turning it into a mud soup. Any prints or trace would have been obscured. I didn't see any remains of the deer either, so it must have dragged off whatever was left or finished the meal there and moved on. I still patrol the same route at night, though I'm more cautious about shining my flashlight in ditches. I told a friend at the feed store in Vermilion I barely slept the night after I saw it, and he said there have been weird sightings near the Bon-Homme County line, folks talking about a pale figure rummaging near the roads. He didn't have details, though. My neighbor, the same one who told me his old story, mentioned that in the late 90s, there were rumors about something lurking around the farmland near the Clay County border, but nobody had any proof. Maybe this is that same thing, or maybe there are more of them. I can't say. I haven't seen it again since that night, but I sometimes get that rush of fear when I'm out after dark, convinced at any moment I might catch a glimpse of it crawling along the fence line. I guess living out here, you become accustomed to seeing wildlife in all sorts of conditions and behaviors, but that was no normal wildlife. I can't find a rational explanation, and it's messing with me worse than I'd like to admit. Sometimes I'll be mending wire or feeding the cattle, and a movement out of the corner of my eye will make my heart skip. I'll whip around expecting to see that pale figure crouched there. Then there's nothing, just my own shadow. I know it sounds paranoid, but after an experience like that, it's hard not to wonder if it's still out there, waiting for another easy meal along the roadside. I don't really share this stuff with many people, as I don't want to become the laughingstock of the area. Folks here appreciate a good yarn, but they're quick to debunk anything that sounds too outlandish. I don't feel like being known as the crazy farmer who's talking about pale monsters in the ditch, but the sight of it, those impossibly long arms, that bizarre posture, the wet, gnawing sound, none of that is going away anytime soon.